us here tonight so that we can all learn more about this together. I'd be remiss if I didn't add that the Foundation relies on your financial support to make work like this possible as a community catalyst and as an informed decision maker and difference maker in our community. So if you value your experience here tonight, I hope you'll consider a gift to our operations or our community trust grant program that many of you are familiar with. You can designate it to Health and Human Services, donate online, or use one of the bright yellow envelopes on the information table. And finally, if I may take a point of personal privilege, I want to echo what my friend Frank said and just say how really fortunate, blessed we are to know extraordinary human beings like Sheriff Joe Pelle and Stan Garnett. They're not only great public servants, but they're great men, and it's a privilege to know you both. So now I'd like to introduce our master facilitator for the evening, who is a leader and remarkable person in her own right, Elvira Ramos, who's our Vice President of Programs and Inclusive Leadership.
Let me take care of a few housekeeping things first before we get going. Our schedule is we'll go till about 6:40, where we'll start taking questions, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. For those of you who don't know, bar is in the back, food is outside, restrooms are right out here. And let's see, on your chair, you notice there was a list of resources on every seat. Because of the size of the group, we've left note cards on your seat as well, and we ask that you use those for questions. We'll be picking those up around 6:40 again and bringing them up to the front of the room. So, for those of you who don't know me, I've worked in the nonprofit spheres for more decades than I care to admit some days. Including, I was the staff development director for MHCD, the Mental Health Center of Denver, for 6 years. And during my time there, I met some of the most extraordinary, strong, brilliant people I've ever worked with. But they were people who suffered from not only severe and persistent mental illness, but the hardship that goes along with it every day, not the least of which is the social that they have to live with every day. So how does this discussion tonight that we're going to have fit in with the need for more of a greater focus on mental health in Boulder County? So as Jeff mentioned, many people in Boulder County, people who attended our listening tours, our donors, leaders of nonprofits, local government and businesses have made it clear that concerns about mental health are at the top of our collective priority list. That's why you all are here. Boulder County Health agrees. I was privileged to be a part of the community health assessment process, reviewed public health data. We took a lot of community input, narrowed down the priorities, and came up with a community voting process that led to the selection of mental health as a community health priority for the next 5 years. So communities within Boulder County are also tackling this as well. I'm very proud of the city of Longmont, which is where I live, which is really understanding the urgency of these issues. We've seen leadership there from the city, police chief, the nonprofits, and Chief Butler there from the city of Longmont just announced that the city of Longmont received a couple of very big, significant grants to deal with the work that they've been doing here. They've been doing some real community-based work that I think could be replicated throughout Boulder County. We encourage you to be involved, to ask for help. If you, a family member or a friend needs it, to be open about your concerns, to support a culture of respect, to give financial or volunteer help where you can. All of our local organizations to work the needs, to meet the needs of people with mental illness and their families need more financial support. Your decision to join us tonight is a great step toward learning more and to support that culture of awareness. Thank you so much for being here. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to cover kind of 4 basic areas. We're going to talk a little bit about the history. So why do we find ourselves where we do today? We're going to talk about the tension that exists between public safety and the individual rights of people who suffer from mental illness. We're going to talk about kind of the landscape today, what's going on, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the hope is for the future and what some of you can do to get involved and stay involved. With that, I'm pleased to introduce 2 exceptional people that I'm very proud to know, who lead with compassion and have a very unique perspective on mental health in Boulder County. I'm very proud that they have been to speak to our leadership fellows a number of times and have been in the news quite a bit lately, both of them. So thank you very much, Sheriff Joe Pelle. He's been a peace officer in Boulder County since 1980. He has a master's degree working with children alongside of his wife. In 2003, he became the Boulder County Sheriff. Stan Garnett was elected as district attorney for Boulder County in November 2008. Before that, he assumed the position of district attorney. He was a trial lawyer for 22 years with the firm of Brownstein, Hine, Farber, and Schreck. So we're going to start with, I think we're going to start with Joe. You're going to talk a little bit for us, please, of why do we find ourselves here? What's going on? And then, Stan, we want you to talk about a little bit about the structure of our county's criminal justice system. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to stand so I can see folks in the back. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and something I've been working hard on. Chairing a subcommittee, the Colorado Criminal Justice Commission, and also serving on the Governor's Task Force on Mental Health, trying to develop a strategic plan for our state. And we're close to the release of that final strategic plan. So this is something that's been going on, and my staff often wonders why I go to Denver twice a week, but that's probably why. When I took office in 2003, 13% of the people in our jail had a diagnosed serious mental illness. Today, on any given day, roughly 40% of the people in our jail have an Axis I diagnosis of serious mental illness. That's roughly about 140, 150 people every day that we're trying to take care of in the jail. Several decades ago, we, as part of a public policy, decided to deinstitutionalize mental health care. People were languishing in mental institutions, and it was deemed to be inhumane. So, mental illness treatment, the treatment of mental illness was deinstitutionalized. But community-based solutions were never fully funded. And as a result, the people who were inhumanely being held in mental institutions are now being held in county jails and state prisons. A public policy failure. Places that are not equipped and do not help, in most cases, that illness. Now we are striving, trying hard to provide services in our jail, to employ people, both ourselves and through contracts with mental health partners and jail-based behavioral health systems to provide assessment and stabilization and treatment where we can. We do about 600 suicide preventions a year. We have a number of successful suicides every year in our jail that our staff has to deal with. And we constantly have people on suicide protocol in our jail. The difficulty with the jail is there's only so much we can do. We're not a hospital. We can't force medication, and some people who are acutely mentally ill require that. They're self-harm, they do self-harm. It's very difficult for our staff to deal with that. The other thing that's occurred over the years, through the Great Recession, is the availability of hospital beds through the state and private systems have dwindled away to near nothing. I have people in my jail who are very seriously, acutely mentally ill, psychotic, trying to harm themselves, and some of them have been waiting now 80 to 90 days to get into the state hospital, and that backlog just keeps building. So we have a serious issue in our community. There are a number of ways to respond to it, and so I'm not all doom and gloom up here today. I am going to talk about some hope on the horizon and what we're trying to accomplish, but the issue is serious, and the threat to our health and our safety as a community is real, so we need to respond to it. So I'll stop with that, and I'll talk later about where we should go.
I know that Joe gave me permission to ask this question. Many of you know that he's been through a very tragic personal experience with this, and you said you would be willing, I'm sure it's kind of the elephant in the room that people are wondering about, if you would mind sharing a little bit about how terrific your son is doing now, please.
My son Jeff is 32 years old. He's married, and he's a deputy sheriff in Douglas County. He was one of the 4 deputies who were shot. Several weeks ago, Jeff sustained very serious injuries. He had collapsed lung, ruptured diaphragm, ruptured liver, 3 fractured ribs, lost a lot of blood, nearly died, but he's doing better. Today, in fact, he's home, and they just took the last of his drains and IV ports out, and his dogs got to come home and be with him. He's lost 35 pounds. He's sore and tired and trying to heal, but he's going to get better, and he'll start his mental health therapy on Thursday. When he was in the hospital, he says, I don't understand why I have to go talk to a stranger about how I feel. And I said, for the same reason you had to have a stranger cut you open and take the bullet out of your throat. And that seemed to resonate. So we're doing good. The man who shot him was mentally ill, and it's a familiar story. In and out of the VA system, in and out of community-based mental health treatment. He dropped out, refused to cooperate, refused to take his medication, and like so many stories, there's nothing we can do to force that. There's no provision in the law for us to take all his guns away. And so there are still a lot of issues. And the irony of my son being shot by someone in this condition, well, I've been working on this topic for the last 2.5 years, is pretty crazy. I hold no malice or anger towards the man who shot my son, but I would like to work towards solutions because of that.
We invite Garnett to talk to us a little bit about the structure, a little bit about the history of the criminal justice system and how it relates to these issues.
Great. Is this working? I think it's working. All right. Thanks so much for having us, Ovita and Jeff. Terrific to be here. And Frank, V is a great organization. I wanted to mention as well, I've got a few of my staff here tonight, which is great because they all have better things to do and personal lives, but it was nice of them to be here tonight. Thank you guys for being here. I do have a great staff, and it's really been a delight to work with them. Let me mention one thing about Joe. Joe is not only a great sheriff, but he and I go way back. We both went to Fairview High School. I'm a little bit older than him. He was in class with my little brother, and we have kids the same age. My youngest son is 31. Joe's son is 32. We both have some grandchildren, and obviously what he's been going through has been very difficult and for both him and his wife, Stephanie. What I want to do is talk a little bit about how we got to where we are. Many of you who know me know that I tend to look at everything from a historical perspective, which gets a little annoying if you happen to be my wife. But it is how I look at the world, and as a lawyer, history is very important because the legal system developed historically and is adapted to different pressures, and the more we understand that, the better we can implement things. I'm also an expert on the history of the Boulder District Attorney's Office. If anybody ever wants to know a lot of trivia about this office, I'm happy to tell you. But let me say a couple things that are really important. I'm very proud of the American justice system. I think it's an excellent justice system. I think it does a better job at the fundamental task of a justice system than any justice system I've seen in the entire world. And some of you know that I've been traveling to Latin America a lot. I've been consulting with governments there about how to improve their justice systems. Our justice system is an amazing system. It's fair, it's transparent, and it's just, and it does a great job at determining the truth of what happened in fact patterns, which is one of the most important jobs of the justice system. Think about it for a minute. Before anything happens, in terms of consequences, etc., You have to determine the truth of the facts. And our system does that elegantly, beautifully, and publicly. And we should be very proud of that. However, our system, let's talk a little bit about where the American justice system came from. The American justice system is a direct descendant of the English common law. And the English common law developed in England in a very Christian, very religious tradition, a view that grew out of certain assumptions about human nature and about human behavior that were rooted in a particular religious view that evolved somewhat over time, but it was basically a view that looked at everything morally, concluded that every act that a person took was a moral decision, and that the justice system had an obligation to impose a punishment that was appropriate for a bad moral act. In other words, if you steal something, the justice system needs to punish you because you did that and it's a moral failing on your part, and that's how we see human nature. Now, if you know much about the English common law, you also know that in the 19th century in England, pretty much the penalty for about everything was the death penalty. Everybody got hanged for about everything. There was not a lot of effort to figure out proportionality, but that was the view. Nobody agonized over whether someone was mentally ill because society's view of mental illness was pretty undeveloped. Now, in the 19th century, late in the 19th century, the English courts adopted what was called the Mcnaughton Rule. And the Mcnaughton Rule, as many of you probably know, was the beginning of trying to deal with mental health in the justice system. Mcnaughton was a defendant in the late 19th century in England who committed a horrible crime, but he was so obviously mentally ill that the English common law courts adopted a rule that said, if you, as a result of mental disease or defect, cannot understand the moral significance of what you have done, you cannot be found guilty. And you need to be dealt with differently than a person who has intentionally done something. Now, the American courts adopted the Mcnaughton Rule, and the insanity rule we have in Colorado now is a direct descendant of the Mcnaughton Rule. When you hear people talk about insanity, insanity means in the American justice system that someone has such a serious mental health defect that at the time they committed the crime, they could not appreciate the moral wrongness of what they were doing. Now, let me give you a couple of quick examples of that, and then I'm going to circle back. I'm sure everybody has followed the horrible, horrible case of the shooter at the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs. Now, this is a case where a person armed with lots of automatic weapons came and killed people, including a police officer at the Planned Parenthood clinic. He has had an insanity plea entered for him by his lawyers, and the issue of his competency is being sorted out through the courts right now. Now, competency is important because it's different than insanity. Competency means, is the person so mentally ill that they are not able to assist their lawyers in their defense? And the defendant in that case has been brought up several times, and every time the judge has ruled he's incompetent, his mental illness is so significant he cannot even assist the lawyers in his defense. Now, I mention that because I want to give you guys an example that makes some sense, I hope, of how the modern justice system is trying to integrate concepts of mental health into seeking justice. Because we live in a much different world than 19th century England or 19th century United States. Currently, most people understand the problems of mental health, how mental health can impact behavior, how mental health can be a factor in people choosing to do horrible things like the shooter in the case that injured Joe's son. But we also live in a society that retains significant moral views of right and wrong and of behavior, and that expects the justice system, when somebody does something that society concludes is bad, to impose a punishment that is just and proportionate and fair. And what all of us, including my staff who are here and everybody who's home with their kids tonight, wrestle with every day is, how do we seek justice? How do we protect the community? How do we make sure that truth is found? And also, do it in a way that respects our developing understanding of how mental illness can cause people to do things that impact public safety. Those are the issues that we wrestle with all the time. It's fascinating work, and it's changing.
So, Joe, I'm going to ask you, can you talk a little bit about the role of the Sheriff's Department? You know, at what point might you be called to deal with someone? Give us a couple of examples, please. And what role do your sheriffs play in all of this?
Sure. So the Sheriff's Office has a number of different roles. First of all, we're the cops in the parts of the county that don't have a police department. So if you're living outside the city of Boulder, Longmont, Lafayette, Louisville, we're the police. So all the unincorporated areas, small towns, rural areas, the mountains up to the Continental Divide, we're the police. So we get called whenever there is a disturbance, a problem, when someone is threatening to harm themselves or harm others. We're the first responders. There are no other first responders to calls like that. By default, the police have become the interveners in mental health crisis in our community. We're trying to change that. We are changing it, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. I also, as part of my constitutional statutory responsibilities, I'm responsible for managing the jail, supervising the jail, making sure it's safe and secure, taking people to court, and all the alternative sentencing programs and all of the other things that go along with that. So first of all, there's a thing in the literature now around mental health called the sequential intercept model. So a lot of you probably heard about that, right? But it's along the line, the timeline of people's contact with the justice system. There are a number of very important intersects or points where people can be diverted out of the justice system and into the appropriate mental health treatment. The issue that we've had for years, for decades, is that when we respond to a call for a person in crisis, we had two choices: the emergency room or the jail, because there were no other alternatives. Neither one of those are great places to go with someone in crisis, but often it was to the emergency room and then wait for a crisis worker to come interview the person and then babysit that person for hours and hours at times, usually to have them leave before we were done with the paperwork. That's how it's been done forever. There are different ways to handle that. The first intercept model, the first intercept point when we're dealing with someone in crisis is on the sidewalk or the front door of their house. And so we had to develop a better model of how we respond. So we are doing something in Boulder County that's innovative, and it's going on across the country. It's called a co-responder model. In our county, it's called EDGE. We funded it with the SAMHSA grant initially, and it's become successful, but it's where we have mental health professionals that respond with the police or the sheriff to the crisis and try to do intervention, stabilize, de-escalate, and usually talk the person into, yeah, there's a guy right there. Usually, hopefully, talk the person into accepting a ride to treatment or accepting a referral to treatment. And it works. And it's working all across the country. And it's way better than a policeman, a fire truck, and an ambulance, I gotta tell you. And it's a lot more cost effective, but still expensive. Now, our EDGE program was funded by the city of Boulder, the city of Longmont, and Boulder County. It is unfortunately not 24 hours a day yet, and it unfortunately doesn't serve a lot of the small communities in the eastern part of the county, like Lafayette, Louisville, and Erie, and up in the mountains, like Netherland, where they could use a lot of help from EDGE. But we're trying to expand that and grow it because it's a successful model. There are other places in the sequential intercept model I can talk about later where people can be diverted out of the justice system, but it's on that first contact that is so important. So we've trained all of our cops in critical incident, CIT, critical incident training. Huh?
Crisis intervention.
Thank you, crisis intervention training. I know it's CIT. We've also introduced mental health first aid, and we're using that. And then in addition, we're using the co-responder model as much as we possibly can. And we're making some changes in the way we respond to people in crisis, and that's going to help on the very front end.
And I'm going to ask you if you would talk a little bit about that tension that your office sees between individual rights, right, and people who are suffering from mental illness and the safety of all of the rest of the community.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a challenge for all of us involved in the legal system. You know, one of the things we don't always understand as Americans is how much the Bill of Rights and the view of individual rights is really part of our culture, part of our view of the world, and part of how we approach almost every problem. One of the things that's been interesting for me as I've worked in Colombia and Mexico and Bolivia on legal issues is how many other countries don't see everything through the view of individual rights. In the United States, we see everything. We try to deal with the homeless in Boulder County, and immediately the issue is raised whether somehow the way we're dealing with them has violated individual rights, et cetera. So, which is fine, and that's just the way we are, but we should be realistic. Not everybody else in the world looks at everything through the first 10 amendments of the Constitution of the United States of America. So what that means is, when we have a criminal case, we are constantly balancing issues. And let me give you a couple of fact patterns that I hope will be helpful. Both of them are cases that have been resolved, so there's nothing unethical about me talking about them. But these are the kind of issues that my staff deal with every day when they come in and they take the cases that come to them. We had a case not too long ago of a mother in Boulder who pulled up at a stop light in the middle of the morning, and she was there waiting for the light to change, and a guy jumped on her hood of her car with a knife, huge knife, and plunged it through the windshield of her car, which you can do now because most windshields don't shatter. Well, you can imagine what the impact was on this young mother, sitting there thinking she was just driving to work, etc., and suddenly this thing happens, which is very violent, very threatening, very much an impact on her, but by a person who immediately, when you tell this story at a barbecue or a cocktail party, and I know this because I've told it, everybody goes, that guy's crazy, right? The first reaction is, that's frickin' crazy. Who does that? Well, that may be true, although crazy is not a clinically significant term. But let's imagine that one of Joe's sheriff's deputies or a police officer responds to that scene. Here's a terrified woman, a knife has been plunged through her car, and here's a guy yelling and threatening and doing things. What are you going to do with that guy? Well, you're going to arrest him because you're going to take him off the street because of the threat of impact on public safety, and you want to get him where he can't do this again. Now, where are you going to take him? Well, eventually you're going to take him to the Boulder County Jail and sort that case out from there. But the initial reaction that is essential in many cases like this is to take a person like this where they will not harm someone. And we have an obligation as custodians of public safety and of justice to make sure that we do what we need to protect people. But once that guy hits the legal system, you then begin this process that I referred to earlier. And let me talk about another case, which is a good illustration as well. I tried in February of 2016, I've tried several serious homicides, but in February of 2016, I tried the Dino Lane case. Dino Lane was a woman with virtually no criminal record, no indication of mental illness or dysfunction, who used a Craigslist ad to lure a woman who was 8 months pregnant to her house, attacked her. It was a fetal abduction case, almost killed the woman, did kill the fetus. This was a horrible case, obviously. I tried the case. We got conviction as charged. She got 100 years in prison. Never in that case did the defense ever raise any issue about mental health. Never pled insanity, never pled incompetency, and this defendant never had a mental health evaluation in that process. Her rights were respected throughout the process. She was taken to trial publicly, legally, appropriately, convicted totally appropriately, but never in the system was there an evaluation of the mental health impact. Now, that was fine with the victim, who didn't particularly care whether this defendant was mentally ill or not. But my view is the legal system has to find a way to sort these issues out. Something horrible happens, there does need to be a reaction where society goes, that's fair, that's right, and keeps people from becoming vigilantes, which is a big role of the district attorney, is to convince people that if you do something bad to somebody else, there will be a consequence, and we don't need people creating lynch mobs to impose justice. But I do believe in hindsight that that case is a case that illustrates the clumsiness of how the interplay occurs between individual rights and mental health issues.
And I'll tell you that that case left a huge mark on the community in Longmont and impacted the mental health of people who live in the community, and was really traumatizing for most of the residents there. Mental health partners did some trauma work with the community as well because of that. So let me remind you that you have note cards on your chairs. As you're thinking of questions as we go along, jot them down. If you need another note card, if you need another pen, raise your hand and we'll take care of you. So another reminder is that neither of our panelists is allowed to comment on individual or pending cases. So remember that if you would, and they will politely decline if there's a question about that. I'm going to ask, Joe, talk a little bit again for me, help me understand. When people are picked up, and there's such a high percentage now of folks in the jail, are they accused of crimes? Have they been committed crimes? At what point are they? Help us understand where they are in the process, please.
Sure. So they're not coming to jail unless they've committed a crime. And Stan has recited some very serious cases, right? Scary cases. But of those 150 people in the jail, most of them are frequent flyers. They haven't committed serious crimes. They are, or a large part, are homeless, substance dependent. They have both mental illness and substance dependency, oftentimes self-medicating with alcohol or drugs, and committing a host of minor crimes to support themselves or make their way through the streets. And those are the folks who I believe need to be diverted out of the justice system and into some kind of a strong treatment regimen program. So that's the second step in the sequential intercept model. There are people who are arrested because at the time it's a violent scene or a scary scene, or they're threatening others or they're threatening themselves, and the cop, in the best interest of the community and the person, doesn't have a lot of other options but to arrest them. And quite frankly, with many of these folks, the only way to force them or get them into treatment or help sometimes is through the jail system. And that's a reality. And so the second step, the second thing we're working on and trying to accomplish are diversion programs, mental health diversion programs from the justice system, either pre-filing or post-filing, either involving the district attorney and public defender in the court, and an assessment at the jail or a screening, and then an acceptance for treatment by the defendant and the mental health provider. What we do at the jail, a number of things. I have mental health professionals that work at the jail who do assessment and try to stabilize folks and screen for suicide, ideation, that kind of thing. Then we also have a contract with mental health partners, our community-based mental health partners, who, with the hope that they provide clinical time, treatment, prescriptions, that kind of thing in the jail, so that when a defendant, when an inmate leaves the jail, that treatment plan and those medications and all that kind of stuff follows them into the community. Because if you can prevent a lapse of time, you can oftentimes keep them on the rails, right? If you hand them a business card and say, make an appointment with these folks, it's not going to work. We oftentimes are successful by walking people across the parking lot of the jail over to the crisis unit and handing them off. Oftentimes we'll be able to keep them in treatment and in a plan by doing that. It works a lot better than kicking them out the front door with bus tokens. So
right?
Okay,
Is that okay?
I'll keep going. David.
Stan, I see you nodding. Would you like to comment on what he just said?
Well, I agree with it. Let me say one thing just so it's clear. A county jail under the Colorado system is really used for two things. It's used to hold people who need to be held awaiting trial. So, for example, a murder defendant, I think Joe currently has several murder defendants who are awaiting trial this year. So they're in the county jail awaiting it. Once they're convicted, if they're convicted of a felony, if they're sentenced to prison, they go to Canyon City or one of the state prisons. That's where they go. So the first people that are held in the jail are people awaiting trial who the courts have determined are too dangerous to put into the community. We can talk a lot about how we try to sort that out. And the other people who are held in the jail are people who have been punished with misdemeanor sentences that includes county jail time. So, for example, if you get 3 DUIs in Boulder County, which, as I like to say, most people go through life and never get a DUI. You got to try pretty hard to get 2. And if you get 3, it means you're a public safety risk of some consequence. People who get 3 DUIs in Boulder County most of the time, and Rainey, you can probably answer this, what's the standard sentence for a 3rd DUI?
I would say 280 days.
280 days. So in other words, they're not sentenced to prison. They would be sentenced to 280 days, which is what's about 9 months. Of course, with good time and everything else, they're out in about 4. But they are sentenced to the county jail. So that's who's in the county jail. We work very hard, Joe's office, my office, the courts, probation, to try to make sure we only are using county jail beds for people that need to be there. We do a lot of things to do that. One of the, Raina Bias is here, is one of my district court deputies, and she's specializing in mental health. She's on a committee called GAPS. GAPS is an acronym. Heaven only knows what it stands for, but it's a, and you can't, let me tell you, if you're going to work in Boulder County, don't hope to understand all the frickin' acronyms.
You can do a whole paragraph.
Yeah. But GAPS is a committee that meets once a month. It's a public defender, the district attorney, the head of the jail, the chief judge, and I think probation. And we look at, this committee has brought forward inmates who are having difficulty, who are clearly having difficulty because of mental health issues in the jail, who've been sentenced, etc. And we sit down as a group and to try to figure out, is there something else we can do other than have this person serve out their time in the jail? And as Joe said, a key part of it is making sure that if they are released, that we're giving them the treatment, etc., that they need to integrate safely back into the community and not just commit another crime.
So, Stan, I know that you have done a lot of work with the Latino community and with the immigrant community as well, and that you're very well respected in those communities. Is there any impact in terms of culture that you've perceived in these kinds of charges and sentencing and decisions?
Well, thank you, Elvira. That's a good question, and I certainly don't claim to be an expert on views of different cultures, but I have observed some things. First of all, as I mentioned, Latin American countries, which have many of them have huge problems in their justice systems, make no mistake about it, and I'm not shy about suggestions on how to improve them. But there's many things they do much better than us. The first one is Latin American cultures tend to be very family-based. People take care of each other. It's expected that you take care of each other. If somebody's got a problem, the family finds a way to take care of them. That has a huge impact, for example, on homelessness, something we struggle with in the United States. And number 2, because when you talk, for example, in La Paz, Bolivia, about the problem of homelessness, they get the problem. But it's not nearly as chronic as it is in the United States for a couple of reasons. First of all, people tend to take care of each other, make sure they can sleep here. There's no sense of the individualistic culture of the United States, which again, I think we sometimes forget how much we're rooted, especially here in the West, in a rugged, rights-based, individualistic view of who we are. Next, they certainly do have a view that's different about the impact of mental health. There is a stigma, I think, in many Latin American cultures about subjecting oneself to mental health treatment. I think there's a sense, too, and again, I don't claim to be an expert, I can just tell you what's been relayed to me, that the United States is sort of freaking obsessed with mental health, that we talk about it all the time and we prescribe opioids to everybody. Not that that's necessarily a mental health issue, but there were always, although it has there's some interesting overlap there, that we tend to constantly think every issue needs to be treated in some sort of formalistic mental health way. There is a stigma attached to that in some situations, which I think makes it harder for people to come forward, like Joe's son is getting ready to do, and to say, I need to talk to a stranger about what's happened to me to form some perspective on that. So I think that is an issue.
Talk a little bit more about that opiates. You said there was some kind of connection.
Well, I think we are a society that loves to take drugs. Don't have any confusion about this. And let me just also say, and I can tell you this after almost 10 years as district attorney, one of the secrets that nobody likes to talk about in America is people like to get high. Whether it's alcohol, whether it's marijuana, whether it's other drugs, human beings like to be intoxicated. And so when you add that to our incredibly robust pharmaceutical industrial complex, which is set up with, all the problems we have in our health system, which are enormous. But what we don't have problems with is prescribing drugs to people and making sure they can buy them. And so what you have with the opiate crisis, and we could do a whole session about it, is a long tradition of dealing with issues around, I think, a mixture of physical pain and mental health pain that can be dulled by prescribing opiates that has created our current crisis. And why has it created our current crisis? Because a lot of people are making a whole lot of money off this crisis. And it's been hard for the government to come in and intervene because we don't have good mechanisms for that. And it leads to all of, I read this morning, in the United States last year, we had something, I forget what the number was, a huge number of overdose deaths from opiate addiction. And we see them in Boulder County all the time. We should have the coroner come to one of these because we get dozens and dozens of opiate overdose deaths from people who have either been prescribed or have become hooked through various things. There's definitely a mental health aspect to that.
I want to make sure that we get some time for them to talk about what they think the solutions are and to have time for your questions. But Joe, I want to put you on the spot and ask you another question. So when we're talking about individual rights, one of the hottest issues right now to do with individual rights is gun control. Can you talk about that in relation to this topic tonight?
Well, I do my own hair.
So there.
So gun control and just gun control in regards to mental health.
With individual rights, you know?
Regarding individual rights. Okay. So one of the issues that I've had over the last 4 decades of doing this is we run across people in crisis all the time. People who are obviously unstable even in layman's eyes, who are potentially harmful to themselves or others. And unless, under Colorado law, unless someone is adjudicated to be mentally ill, there is no avenue to take their guns away. There's no civil process. There's no avenue for us to go to the courts and say, this gentleman is a danger to himself or others. We can take him in, based on that criteria, if someone's in imminent danger to themselves or others, we can take someone in on a 72-hour hold. They can go to the crisis center, they can be interviewed, they can be released 3 hours later, and the gun that we took away from them, because they were threatening to kill themselves, we have to give back to them at the time. There's no answer to that. I'm a Second Amendment person. I was born in Burlington, Colorado. My relatives have guns in the back windows of their trucks. I grew up hunting and fishing, and I grew up as a police officer, and I have a strong idea around the Second Amendment. But I also think there has got to be room in the national debate and the state debate for some common sense. And the things around automatic weapons and bump stocks and, offending someone's rights because they're in a crisis, at least for a period of time, a cooling period, a reasonable period of time to make sure they're stable. need some kind of treatment, whatever. There's got to be a better solution than what we have today, which is the only way we can keep somebody from buying a gun or possessing a weapon is to adjudicate them through civil court and commit them. And that doesn't happen to only a very small percentage of people. Am I correct in that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Do you want to say some more about the Intercept model that you were talking about with us earlier?
Yeah, sure.
Oops.
So the inter.
There you go, buddy.
Hello? It's a little slow, it's like me. So the Intercept model, of course, is on the sidewalk at the front door, upon arrest, prior to filing, post-filing, when the district attorney, the public defender, and the courts have had a chance to get involved with someone's assessment and screening and develop a plan, refer them out. Post-conviction, where someone's on probation, and we have that in Boulder County. We have a strong program called PACE for people with coexisting mental illness and substance abuse issues, where we have mental health treatment, probation officer, case manager, all under one roof. One-stop shopping, which is awesome because these folks don't necessarily keep appointments, and they're not good at getting across town to a bunch of different places. So one place for them to go to a group, get some help, get a plan, find employment, get on benefits, pee in the cup, talk to the probation officer, and get squared away. And it's that group of people, those 50 people or so in that program, we're saving 10,000 jail bed days per year, that group, because of that program. So that's working. The final piece of this that doesn't exist and is so critically needed in Colorado is treatment for, in a secure setting, for people who are acutely mentally ill, who are a danger to themselves and the community, and are charged with serious crimes, who can't be released and can't be diverted. I cannot get a bed in a state hospital, and I cannot get an inmate into private treatment, period. And I have people that are killing themselves and assaulting my deputies and are completely out of our control and their own control, who need a secure hospital setting. And the problem with that, the state hospital, they've cut beds, shut down buildings through the crisis, through the recession. They can't reopen the buildings now because none of them meet code. They're all that old. They just released $21 million back to the state hospital. You know how many beds that's going to open? 17. That's from Dr. Patrick Fox, a friend of mine who's responsible for all this. So the problem with that particular piece, that piece of the Intercept model, is it's extremely expensive. It's being handled in other states. California went to a private-public partnership where a private provider has opened inpatient secure clinics in county jails on a regional basis up and down the state, so that sheriffs like me can take the people that need to be in a hospital to a jail with a hospital, and I'll pay them. You know what happens when somebody has a heart attack in the Boulder County Jail? We call an ambulance. They take them to the hospital. We post a guard, and we pay for their treatment. I don't have that choice with a mental health crisis or with someone who's critically mentally ill. So that's the biggest piece, and that's going to be the most expensive piece.
So let's talk a little bit about what kind of hope is there on the horizon, and what can some of these folks do?
So the hope on the horizon is there is a tremendous amount of momentum statewide about this right now. There are a number of task forces. The Criminal Justice Commission, which is appointed by the governor and includes a lot of powerful people, smart people, and me. We're working on this. The governor has a task force working on this. There's momentum in the legislature behind it. There is, for the first time in a long time, a little more revenue on the state side. still Tabor restricted in many ways, but the momentum and the will and the concern about it is at a level I've never seen before in my time. So I'm excited that we may be in a position to make some changes. Our governor, of course, is going to be gone in a year, but his hope is to have a strategic plan in place that will be a model for the legislature and the next governor to follow in regards to, so that they don't have to do the homework about what to do next. So that plan is kind of laid out there, and that they can start making decisions around policy and funding and legislative stuff, bills, laws, to try to change things.
Stan.
I think all the things that Joe mentioned are terrific, and there's a lot happening, particularly on the front end, and that's very exciting. It is going to take more funding. Funding is a huge issue in Colorado because of Tabor. Footnote is, if we ever want to really tackle these problems, we got to tackle Tabor, but that's another forum. I think a couple of things absolutely have to happen in the legal system. The first one is we need to modernize our definition of insanity. Mcnaughton Rule made sense in 1871, but we're still basically using it now, and it's still basically rooted in that whole very moralistic sense of the justice system. Other states, you may remember when President Reagan the assassination attempt was made at him, that defendant pled insanity, was eventually found not guilty by insanity, and after that, many states revised their insanity rules because they didn't think that worked very well. Colorado did not. Colorado still has the basic system that we've always had. We need to modernize it. We need to make it procedurally more fair, both to defendants and to victims. Because you can imagine if you're a victim of a serious crime and you suddenly get bogged down in a couple years of litigation about the defendant's mental state, how frustrating that can be. So we need to revise insanity. We need to revise our competency statutes. So how that issue is raised is fair, is based on something real and not just in attempts to delay by the lawyers, which my lawyers tell me they see constantly among some of the criminal defense bar in our courts, that they raise competency simply to delay the case, making it harder to try it. We need to modernize those statutes as well. And then we need to make sure that the issues that are presented to juries are issues that make sense to them, that they know how to decide, that are common sense issues. Finally, I would like to see us adopt a broader definition of what we would call impaired mental condition, which is something between insanity and being sane, but is simply something is happening. It's not the level of insanity, but something is happening in your mental state that's impeding your ability to think clearly and to form the mental state to commit a crime. Currently, our statutes on that are very clumsy. They're very odd. How the courts apply them varies from judge to judge. And I think we need to modernize all those things to make the system more fair and to come back full circle to do a better job of integrating our developing sense of human behavior, which still is very much a moral sense. Our society has a moral sense of right and wrong about human behavior, but makes room for accommodating mental health issues in a way that's fair to everybody in the system.
So we're going to be able to take some questions now. A reminder again, they cannot comment on any current cases. We're also live streaming this on Facebook, so we may have some questions from those people who are watching this online. Our staff is prepared to collect your questions. Just raise your hand and I'll do my best to read them. So here's one. I heard a TED Talk explaining a universal assessment tool that could equalize and make more valid, reliable assessments and help judges make decisions. What do you think of this development? Stan, I'm going to direct this to you.
Well, I didn't hear that TED Talk. I can tell you we got more assessment tools in the Boulder County Justice System than you can shake a stick at. Assessment tools are valid, and they can be helpful if they're based on the right protocols, but they are not a substitute for meaningful, thoughtful, fair decisions, and we have to be careful not to overreact them. We see that all the time with pretrial release. We use assessment tools to determine who's going to be dangerous, and they turn out wrong about 20% of the time. and that's an issue. But obviously, we need to keep becoming better and better. But just know these are hard issues. There's no, as my dad used to say, if saving the world was so easy, somebody would have done it by now. If figuring these issues out was easy, somebody would have done it. They're not. They're tough issues. You need to have thoughtful, good people doing them. Assessment tools can be part of it, but they're not going to substitute for judgment.
So, Joe, I'm going to direct this one to you. Is the co-responder role model truly an intervention?
Well, it can be. So much is dependent on the circumstances, the willingness of the participant to participate, the circumstances around which we're in contact. I think it could be an intervention, and in many cases it is simply a de-escalation or stabilization. I think that's the particular place.
Stan, I'm going to direct this one to you. While some people with mental illness are indeed perpetrators of crime, those with mental illness are much more likely to be victims of crime. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, no, that's very, very true. Absolutely, we see that all the time. Our victim advocates do. Often, one of the biggest tragedies in Boulder County is the amount of domestic violence we have. It's a huge problem. We've got to get a handle on it, and we need to talk about it and bring it out of the shadows. Many, many victims of domestic violence suffer from mental health issues, often related to the domestic violence they've suffered for years. So yeah, it's a huge issue.
And one of the issues we have in the jail with that is around medication. People don't want to be goldfish in the shark tank. And so psychotropic drugs, a lot of the medication really sedates people, mellows them out, lowers their level of awareness and ability to defend themselves, and therefore when they're in a jail setting, they decide to not medicate. And we have trouble with that.
Joe, this is something you and I were talking about earlier, so I'm going to direct this question to you. We hear a lot about secondary trauma around victims of crime. Is there secondary trauma among your staff with regard to the people you've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the issue with the empathy that you feel and the sympathy. There's the issue with the anger that you feel after you've been punched or spit upon or been the victim of a urine bomb or whatever. And then there's the issue, the real trauma that comes with cutting someone down who's hung themselves or hanged themselves and doing CPR on them and trying to revive them. That is absolutely traumatic, and we have to have professional help for our staff to deal with those instances.
Stan, I'm going to ask you, can you talk a little bit about the housing crisis and how criminalizing mental health may have an impact?
Sure. Well, the housing crisis is a crisis, and nothing illustrates it better than the fact that I have 85 employees, and I think at last count, 17 of them live in Boulder County. And think about that for a minute. My folks commute from all over the place to the hardest place to come to in Boulder where there's not even much parking because they can't afford to live in this community. So that illustrates how significant the crisis is. Criminalizing mental health, of course, creates an issue if what you're then doing is punishing people, and I see Greg Harms here from the shelter, which does a terrific job with these very difficult issues. If you end up creating criminal consequences for people that don't have a place to go, that creates a lot of issues. And I am proud to say that my office, as a state office, rarely deals with things like camping bans, whatever. That's all handled by the city attorney. But it's a very complicated issue. And we all hear, Joe and I and the police chiefs, we all hear from people in our community who go, I can't believe I can't go to the Boulder Library, or my kids can't ride the bus down there like I did in the 60s without being bothered by lots of people who are lurking about, and you should do a better job with the homeless, etc. But if you use the criminal law to enforce those things, particularly with people that are mentally ill, you're going to commit serious injustice.
Okay. Joe, in what kind of, can you talk a little bit more about the kind of mental health state a person needs to be in order for you to be able to take their gun away?
So if someone is an imminent threat to themselves or others, a peace officer can take them into custody and place them on a 72-hour hold, which doesn't mean 72 hours by any means, just so you know.
It's kind of like,
That's-
it's like good time at the jail.
Yeah, that's the maximum amount of time. In the course of that, if they're in possession of a firearm, or there's a firearm in the house, or a family member wants to turn over a firearm, we can take that firearm for safekeeping. As soon as the person's released from the 72-hour mental hold, or the 3.5-hour mental health hold, they're entitled to that gun back. And there's no avenue for us to file something, or go to the county attorney and try to get one of those fancy court things. Keep that gun.
Well,
Dan's
let me
going
tell
to talk about the fancy court thing.
yeah, this is a great example of the obsession of our culture with individual rights. The whole gun debate, which has gotten just bizarre beyond belief, in my opinion, is all about individual rights. All about the freaking right to own crazy, extremely dangerous weapons. Which there is that right. There is a right under the Second Amendment that gives you certain rights, but to think that that's what we focus on is very difficult. And what I think we lack more than anything in our society currently is the ability to have discussions like this and to foster discussions of reasonableness. I know very few people who think we shouldn't have a Second Amendment, but I do know that most people want to talk about what does it mean, how's it going to be fairly applied. And if we let the discussion be an obsession on rights and possible infringement of rights, we're going to get it wrong. And that's one of the problems in the American culture right now, is we focus on individual rights at the expense of fairness, reasonableness, and common sense.
So someone reminded us that the title of this presentation had to do with moving from Friday night to Monday morning, and wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. So we talked about from Friday night, arrest on Friday night to Monday morning in court. What does that look like?
Well, Joe can talk about arrests on Friday night. I can talk about court on. First of all, court's not on Monday morning. It's Monday at 2. You know why? You know why it's Monday at 2? Because we have a lot of people that need to sober up before they go to court. And if you had it Monday at 8, there'd be a lot of people that were still intoxicated. So you do it at 2 in the afternoon. One thing we haven't talked about much is domestic violence. We have an amazingly effective domestic violence statute in Colorado that works very well. Also gives us a right. It's one of the few ways we have to take away guns. If somebody is subject to a protective order under a domestic violence case, we have the right to have them relinquish their guns. What we haven't figured out is a very good way to do that, which is a whole nother discussion. But what's very, very common is someone will be arrested on Friday night for a domestic violence case. They will be held until Monday at 2 o'clock. They're brought before the judge, and their rights are read to them. We try very hard in this county, have no doubt of this, to get everybody out of jail that we possibly can. Joe and I are in monthly meetings on this topic, actually more than monthly. We try to get as many people. We all agree that nobody should be held in jail awaiting trial unless they have to be there for public safety. But trying to figure out who that is and how we assess that, assessment tools, et cetera, is a real challenge, and we need to get it right.
About 10,000 people a year get arrested and booked who are kept to the jail. The majority of them never see the back of the jail. The majority of them post a bond or get a PR bond within a few hours of being arrested. People that are committed in domestic violence and are required to see the courts, people who can't make bond, who aren't eligible for a PR bond, who have warrants or holds in other counties, those people end up staying. And so they get dressed in, they're in the booking room for a number of hours. It takes a long time to book somebody. You have to do a lot of paperwork, ask a lot of questions, do a lot of screening. And then they're booked in and they're taken to a place called intake, where all new inmates go, because the people who come into the jail, the first 72 hours are the most dangerous in regards to detoxification, anger, sadness, depression, all those things. So we keep an especially close watch on those folks for the first 72 hours. And then we have a courtroom in the jail, which is rare, but a huge convenience and something we're going to try to expand in the next year or so as we modernize our jail facility, so that we don't have to transport all 60 or 80 of those folks on Monday all the way across town to the Justice Center. And so they'll make a first appearance on Monday, where, again, the ones that didn't get bonded out on Friday night will be advised, protection orders will be put in place, bonds will be set, and most of them then will be released, with the exception of the very few who are the most dangerous or have committed the most serious crime, or who have, and this happens a lot. People don't just do crime in Boulder County, so a lot of these folks will have warrants in Adams and Weld and Larimer, and so we end up holding them for other jurisdictions as well.
Let me add one very quick thing. There is a lot of work done by the bond commissioners and others to assess information, do the assessments, figure out who these people are. My deputies then, to get ready for 2 o'clocks, get all that paperwork at about 12:30. And they're expected to review all that paperwork, show up at court at 1:30, negotiate with the public defender, and then handle bond arguments at 2 o'clock, which is why this is such a risky part of the justice system. We often don't really know that much about defendants, and my staff get a stack of files, are now electronic when it works, and they have to review those and decide to argue to the court whether somebody should be held. It's a very intense process, and it's one that's very high risk.
So I want to thank everybody. We are unfortunately have so many questions that we're not able to get to, and we do want to honor the commitment of time that we made to you all and to our speakers, and I want them each to have an opportunity for some closing comments. And Joe, I'll start with you if that's all right.
So thank you all for coming and your interest in this topic. It's heartening to work in a community where people actually turn out to have these discussions. That's a big deal. Secondly, Stan is about to let the door hit him in the butt. This is probably one of his last public appearances as the district attorney, and I just want to say Stan has been a remarkable prosecutor. He's raised the bar at Boulder County in regards to the quality of prosecutions, the transparency with the community, the training and the cooperation with law enforcement, and the level of communication with law enforcement throughout the county. So I want to congratulate him and thank him for his 10 years of his district.
Well, thank you, Joe, and let me just wrap up by saying, first of all, people should be very proud of the quality of law enforcement we have in Boulder County. It's remarkable, and they're committed, they care about doing the right thing, and they do the right thing, and it's wonderful. It's why we have such low crime rates. I'll tell you the other thing that's wonderful about Boulder County, and Joe alluded to it. I've now been in elected office in Boulder County for 17 years, because I was on the school board before this. And let me tell you, school board's 20 times harder than district. Because everybody's always mad at you when you're on the school board, no matter what you do. But this, my line has always been, and I'm sure many of you've heard about it, Boulder County is a place where everybody has an opinion about everything. And it's a strong opinion. Nobody has like a mediocre opinion. And people have time on their hands, so they're happy to come and tell you what their opinion is. That's what makes Boulder County wonderful. And all of you stay in touch with me, stay in touch with other elected officials, because this is a vibrant, interesting community that gets it right most of the time, because people like you care and you speak up. And when one of us gets it wrong, you tell us, and you hold us accountable. So it's great to be here.
So I want to thank you all also, and I want to personally thank you both. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with both of you, and I absolutely enjoy working with you both, so thank you so much. We have some closing comments now from Jeff, our CEO.
Before we go, could I ask the staff of the Community Foundation just to kind of rise where you are, so that we may thank you for putting on this event for us? Thank you very much for your great work. What a great group of people to work with. And please thank me in join me in thanking Sheriff Joe Pelle and District Attorney Stan Garnett. Thanks everyone for being here. Don't forget to take the call to action and resource sheets on your chair with you, and we will see you in the community.